Hello and welcome to the revision chapter. I am an English teacher who has been teaching the AQA English Literature Lit B specification since it started in 2017. So my project is to get you from confused to confident, and today we're going to be doing that with the tragic genre, looking at how that has evolved over time to be what we know it is today. So we'll break this down into three main parts for this video. We'll look at what makes the text a tragedy, how the genre has changed over time, and why on earth you need to know this for your A-level course. For those of you who are going for those A's and A stars, there is a cheeky little bonus at the end to help push for higher level thought. So the tragic genre, we're starting with Aristotle. In around 300 BC, he was a philosopher, a huge influential thinker, along with many other people of that time, and we tend to see him as the starting point for the tragic genre. This is partly because he wrote a book called Poetics, in which he kind of started to analyse what makes a tragedy. He said, "Tragedy is the imitation of a serious action with magnitude, intended to evoke fear and pity and achieve catharsis." So this is meant to be something that is somewhat relatable to real life, have extreme kind of consequences, and importantly end with catharsis, where we purge ourselves of those emotions. So according to Aristotle, the plot is key in a tragedy. It is the events that make the tragedy, not the character. The character is secondary to the tragedy. There is a unity of action, a peripeteia and anagnorisis, where there should be a reversal of fortunes, and the tragic hero should have that moment of realization where they have made a mistake. The tragic hero should have a hamartia, a fatal flaw or an error, which causes the tragic suffering. There should also be a catharsis at the end of the tragedy, where the audience are purged of their emotions, having watched the pity and fear on stage. He also created the model of the tragic hero, which we see as like the kind of basic conventions, where it's a person of high status and power who makes some mistakes and ends up dead. So we'll move on to talk about medieval tragedy, and this is relevant because this is where King Lear is set in a medieval Britain, but also if we are studying Keats, that is also set in medieval times and settings. So it borrows a lot of conventions from medieval tragedy there. So when we talk about medieval tragedy, we're talking around the 5th to the 15th century, so there has been quite a significant time leap since Aristotle. A very different society. Tragedy is brought about by circumstances and higher powers, so it is the gods, it is fate that bring about the tragedy. They might be feeling vengeful, they might be punishing somebody for their actions, but it is the gods that bring the tragedy. There's a strong belief in fate, fortune, and divine judgment. Again, the idea of the wheel of fortune, that you start life at one point and things get better, and you go around the wheel and things get worse. And these often served as kind of morality plays, so they would be teaching you a lesson. They were almost didactic in their intentions. So we're going to take a big leap forward in time again to the 16th and 17th century, where we're looking at Renaissance tragedy, which is the time that Shakespeare and other fantastic tragic playwrights were writing. This is important because obviously this is when King Lear or Othello would have been written. So this is different from the medieval because it does return to Aristotle through the study of poetics. A lot of these playwrights would have been familiar with Aristotle, and it's far less dependent on gods giving out punishment and much more about the tragic hero causing their own tragedy. They have a hamartia, they make mistakes, often pride and arrogance, and that causes the suffering and the tragic fall. There's also a big focus on the kind of psychology and the inner thoughts of the tragic hero. So if you think about Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, the madness is essential there. And catharsis comes from emotional, moral, and political lessons, not just seeing pity and fear on stage. There are also a few more conventions which you'll see in quite a lot of Renaissance tragedies, so subplots, comic relief, ghosts, a female confidant, a male servant or companion, and Machiavellian characters. Now you'll see those, a lot of those, in both King Lear and Othello. If we jump forward another little bit further now, Romantic tragedy, this is where we look at Keats in particular, the 18th and 19th century. Now, Romantic tragedy or Romantic movement was born out of rebellion against the neoclassical movement. Neoclassicism was very much revisiting the classics, rewriting them, and doing it in a very conventional way. And this is the opposite of what the Romantic movement was doing. The Romantic movement was all about kind of freedom of thought, of imagination, the power of imagination. So in these tragedies, there's a big focus on the individual who tends to be an outsider within society. They're quite isolated. And the catharsis doesn't come from just seeing pity and suffering on stage. It is very much this overwhelming emotion, like the end of La Belle Dame, where he's just alone and palely loitering. It kind of peters out after this intense moment of love. The plots tend to be more episodic or symbolic, and there's a much looser structure, a big step away from the kind of unified plot that causes the tragedy, according to Aristotle. Okay, we're almost there. So if we look at modern tragedy now, this is where we are looking at Death of a Salesman. So the 20th to 21st century, there is quite significant changes. So there is a big shift away from nobility to ordinary. So think about Willy Loman. He is not a man of high status. He is an everyday man. The tragic flaws tend to be more systemic rather than about the individual. So again, looking at the idea of capitalism and Death of a Salesman being part of the tragic problem as opposed to just Willy Loman's issues. The catharsis, again, is different from what you'd see in Aristotelian tragedy. It's more about disorientation and alienation or political awakening, as opposed to seeing pity and fear and feeling purged of your emotions. Again, the plot tends to be quite fragmented or experimental. Death of a Salesman is very expressionist in genre, and again, it is a big step away from what Aristotle would see as a unified plot. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour as to the main movements of tragedy relevant to the course. So we need to think about why we have this information, why it's going to be useful for us. It's important to remember that the Lit B spec is a genre-focused specification. So the genre is what glues all of these texts together. On top of that, if you see tragedy only in terms of the Aristotelian tragedy, you could be limiting yourself to quite a simple and generalized understanding of this quite complex genre. So in order to go for the higher levels, the more in-depth you know the tragic movements and how they have changed and evolved, the better you'll be able to make interpretations of your texts and position them within those tragic movements. The texts we study do cover a range of them, as we've spoken about in this video, so it will help you to position your argument better if you can talk about a Renaissance tragedy with Renaissance tragic conventions. And in terms of our AOs, AO3, thinking about the context, AO4, thinking about links between the texts, and AO2 analysis, tragedy fits into all of that. So a deeper understanding of the tragic genres will enhance your analysis. So you have made it to the almost end of the video. This is where we are going to talk through our A and A style bonus bits, how we can use the tragic genre in a quite sophisticated way with the use of some prominent critics on the tragic genre. So we're going to be looking at A.C. Bradley and Kiernan Ryan, one who is a Victorian scholar and Kiernan Ryan who is our contemporary. So we'll start with A.C. Bradley. He is a Victorian scholar and he very much popularised the idea that Shakespearean tragedies are driven by the fatal flaw of the tragic hero. You'll see a lot of arguments from A-level students about the tragic hero's fatal flaw being what brings about the tragedy, and that all comes from A.C. Bradley and what he wrote about. He said that human failings like pride, arrogance and ignorance cause the sufferings of the tragic plays. But if we look at Kiernan Ryan, who is still doing talks today, he challenges this long-standing idea stipulated by Bradley. He does not agree that it is the hamartia, the tragic flaw of the tragic hero, that brings about the suffering, but instead the tragedy is driven by systemic failings. It is the society and the issues within society that causes these tragic outcomes. So where A.C. Bradley would argue that King Lear's tragic fall comes from his hubris in the love test, where he's asking everyone to declare their love for him, Kiernan Ryan would argue that Shakespeare is actually using this play to criticise society. It is the systems of patriarchy, inequality, the class system within the society that is causing the tragic outcomes of the play. From an A&A style point of view, I wanted you to have these two little snapshots of these scholars and their arguments, because it's important you see that tragedy isn't just one fixed thing. It's obviously this movement that's changed over time, but also we make our own interpretations of those movements. So although the very popular belief of the tragic hero's flaw causes the suffering, is one that's very valid, there are other more sophisticated ways we could argue as well. So looking at arguments like Kian and Ryan, looking beyond just the tragic hero, can make a more fruitful, interesting and perceptive argument. And that is it. I have tried to reduce many centuries of the tragic movements into a 10-minute video, and I hope that has helped you go from confused to confident. If you could comment below anything you would want me to cover in future videos, that would really help. So thank you and well done.